Is the Catholic Church one Christian denomination amongst many? With scripture, history, ecclesiology, midst full of evidence and reasons why, my guest this week, Catholic convert, former Episcopalian priest Andrew Petiprin, joins me to discuss why the answer is no. The Catholic Church is not simply another denomination amongst a bunch, and there are good reasons to believe this is the case. This is a fantastic, meaty conversation, lots of Newman, lots of church documents, lots of history, loads of scripture. Going to love it, guys. I hope you do. Please watch and enjoy. Hey friends, welcome back to the show. Thanks for watching. Thank you for listening. If you're listening on podcast, hey, your reviews on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify help to push the podcast out to more listeners. So hey, if you can just press pause, leave a rating and review, that'd be fantastic. And thank you for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, hello YouTube world. Thank you for being out there and watching. Please help this channel to continue to grow. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, interact in the comments, guys. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for watching this week. We're in for a treat. I am joined by my friend Andrew Petiprin. He's a founder and editor at the Spe Salvi Institute, a columnist at Catholic World Report, and the host of the Ignatius Press podcast. Not too shabby. It's a fantastic podcast. I was going to say, not too shabby. It doesn't sound very good though, Andrew. He's a former fellow of pop culture at the Word on Fire Institute, author of a number of fantastic books, including for our purposes here today, from Catholic Answers Press, The Faith Unboxed. It's a fantastic book. He lives with his wife and children in Texas. And he is a former Episcopalian priest, a convert to the Catholic faith who crossed the Tyber in 2019. Andrew, welcome. Thanks for being here. Welcome back to the show, and hello.
Hi, Keith. Yeah, thanks for having me back. I enjoyed our first visit some time ago. So great to see you. Your operation has kind of has blown up a bit since I was last with you.
Indeed, sir. It has not exploded, but it has increased in its substantiveness. I appreciate that. Yeah, I looked back. It was, 230 episodes ago when we last talked. So,
oh, man.
It's been a minute. The world was quite different back then. This podcast was quite different back then. And it was awesome to have you back then. Awesome to have you now. This is a great book all about taking the Catholic faith out of the boxes and the preconceived notions that many have about the Catholic faith, or what it is, or how it works, and how it fits together. And this is the exact perfect thing for this show, Andrew. Of course, as a convert yourself, a convert myself, listeners in the audience are often looking into the Catholic Church. New converts are those who are making that journey. This is the exact perfect topic for this show. Now, we've unpacked your own conversion journey, which is a fantastic story. As I mentioned, 230 episodes ago on this show. I don't think it's even on video. It was that early. So it's on podcast. Yeah. I'll put links in the video show notes for people to find that conversation. But for those who have joined us in the last 5 years or so, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of your own journey? Set the table for listeners to know kind of the perspective that you're coming from in this conversation, because you've had an awesome journey. It's great. Tell us a bit about it so listeners can get to know you a bit better, if you can, Andrew. That'd be great.
Sure, Keith. Well, my family background is Protestant in all four directions. Three of my four grandparents were, their family lineage goes back all the way to the Reformation as Protestants of different sorts. My paternal grandfather was he was from Michigan, but his family was French Canadian before that. That's where my name Petiprin comes from. And they were a Catholic family at some point, but my grandfather was an orphan, and he was taken in sort of and cared for by a kindly Presbyterian minister. And so he grew up Protestant as well. And my father, who was a great student of history, but also a bit of a fabulist, told me the tale when I was growing up, and also very interested in history and theology and all things related to our Christian faith and our Christian heritage. My father told me that we were a Huguenot family, that we were at some point anciently a French Protestant family. But it turns out that we haven't. My wife, who's done some kind of genealogical research, has not been able to turn up anything that says that. So there are some Catholics in my background. I'm pleased to say that. But But all that is to say that that's sort of the exception that proves the rule in my family background. We were all Protestants, and I was baptized in my grandparents' living room in Florida by a Presbyterian minister. My mother's family had been all kinds of different things. They had been Southern Baptists, and then they had been Episcopalians. And then when my mom and my dad got married, they mostly were Methodists, kind of, not particularly loyal to any particular group. But we went to Methodist churches when I was very young. It was very mainstream, Wesley hymns, not happy clappy or anything like that. Lots of Bible, singing in choirs. We were definitely a very faithful family, and home religion was very important to my mother. We read the Bible a lot. We sang a lot. I remember, and I may have told you this story before when I was on the show last time, but I thought that you would appreciate it if I mentioned it again. I remember a few times when I was a kid growing up in Protestant churches, particularly Methodist churches, where we would go to Sunday school and leave and not actually go in to worship. We would show up, and it was really kind of about the learning and that experience of kind of learning the Bible and all of that was most important. So that was our family. My parents got divorced when I was 13. This was the mid 90s or kind of early to mid 90s. And we started going to a non-denominational Christian church. And that was kind of when I guess you could say the megachurch movement was sort of getting going. And we lived in Central Florida, and there was a lot of that in the water down there. And so we went to a church like that for a while. It was good for our family. It was the kind of place that someone like my mom, who was going through a divorce and, raising 3 kids, felt very much at home. We all went to the youth group. It was lots of fun. We met lots of friends and all that sort of thing. But I got tired of that. I have to admit to you, Keith, after a few years. And by the time I graduated from high school, I felt very judgmental of that kind of strain of Christianity. I didn't like what I was hearing from the pastor. I wanted to be an intellectual. I was a literary man, and I was into cinema and interested in learning languages. And I don't know, I imagine my life would be something more like, Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible or, something like that. So, but my curiosity and my hunger for kind of spiritual nourishment was always there and very, very real. And so when I went away to college, I started reading C.S. Lewis. I had read him a lot already, but I read him almost like a monk. I mean, I just read him. I read his works, his fiction works, and his nonfiction, his apologetic stuff over and over again. And I really kind of began to cultivate for myself this idea of being a mere Christian, and just kind of settling on the idea that Christianity was true, and that there were also just a lot of questions that I wanted answers to that maybe didn't exist. The answers didn't exist, perhaps, in terms of what the absolute final answer was about, particularly with regard to where one lives one's life as a Christian. That is to say, what is the church? What is the real church? How do I belong to it? So even there, I was already really beginning to focus on that central question about what it meant to be a Christian. Fast forward a little bit, I moved to England. I did some graduate work there at Oxford, and I became an Anglican there. I wasn't a total stranger to the Anglican tradition because, as I said, my mother's family had been Episcopalian as one of their stops along the way, as sort of in the Protestant diaspora. But I was confirmed in the Church of England in 2002. And it was a very meaningful experience. All my friends in England were Church of England people, very high church. And so I began to adopt the position. I guess I began to kind of explore the great theory that it was possible to be a Catholic, but not a Roman Catholic, that there were different branches of the one true church. And all of them had their flaws. Some had fewer flaws than others, but it was okay, perhaps, not to be in full communion with the Pope, with the Bishop of Rome. And I explored that idea for several more years, including during the time when I got married and then eventually got ordained in the Anglican tradition in the Episcopal Church, became an Episcopal priest. I served a congregation in Arizona, and then a congregation in Florida, and then finally moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and served on the bishop's staff of the Episcopal Bishop of Tennessee, John Bowerschmidt. Is a great guy. His brother is Fritz Bowerschmidt, who's a great Catholic theologian and deacon. So, there's Catholicism connected there. But anyway, when I got to Nashville, I wasn't looking after my own church. I was just working, on a diocesan staff. As Providence would have it, I got involved in this ecumenical reading group with a number of nuns from the Dominican community in Nashville. I also met some Catholic priests. I was just in a place in my life, I think the age of my children, and just thinking through our future as a family, where I really felt like we were forced into a decision about where we belonged. And ultimately, Keith, the decision for us, for all four of us, by the way, my wife and 2 children and I, we were confirmed and received our first communion all together, all at once, which is a wonderful thing. And and ultimately, I had my frustrations with Anglicanism, and like John Henry Newman and many others since him, I felt like the theory of Anglicanism ran out of steam. I had my theory. But I wasn't sure that I was, fully in the church. So I had my frustrations. I had frustrations with kind of the liberalizing trend that was going in all kinds of different directions in the Anglican Communion. But ultimately, Keith, it was not a question of running away from what my frustrations were. It was really an inexplicable experience of grace that unfolded over a series of months, where I knew, and then ultimately I shared with my wife, and she experienced that with me, that we knew it was time to bring the gifts that we had been given in our respective Protestant traditions for our whole lives, and I guess also for our kind of the lives of our ancestors before us, and bring them into full communion with the Catholic Church. And as you said in the introduction, that happened in 2019, but actually on the very first day of 2019, on the Solemnity of Mary, Mother of God, January 1st, 2019. So yeah, much has happened since then, but that's my journey that got me all the way into the boat, I guess, Keith.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. A fantastic journey. Like I said before, that your fuller journey, an hour-long treatment of that, which is well worth the listen. I'll put a link in the show notes for that, for listeners and viewers to go and find, because I think it does predate the video, if I remember correctly. I'll have to go back and check, but fantastic story. And I wanted to one quick stop, because I want to talk about part of that story that kind of has blossomed or given birth to this book and the ideas in this book. But one thing that you talk about there is what you bring with you, the gifts you bring with you into the Catholic Church. And I got to just highlight for the listeners and viewers the beautiful Anglican patrimony that exists in the Catholic Church, the Anglican Ordinariate, that means for bringing along all the gifts of that the Anglican Church has and can bring into the Catholic Church in full communion with the Catholic Church. I said before in the show, my very favorite liturgy is the Anglican Ordinariate liturgy. So I'm very biased towards this. And I was not Anglican by any stretch of the imagination. In any part of my journey was I Anglican, but that is such a beautiful liturgy. And now with the availability of the Book of Worship, right, the availability of the Anglican prayers in a Catholic context, I mean, there are so many gifts that the Anglican Church and Anglicans have to bring into the Catholic Church, and that means exists, right? To welcome that community in with open arms and embrace what they have, which is beautiful stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've said in a number of places, Keith, that I believe that the establishment of the personal ordinariates for Anglicans represents maybe the greatest kind of concrete expression of the Catholic Church's ecumenical theology.
Yes.
Because it is a way of saying our ecumenical theology is come home to Rome. I mean, we believe that. We believe that we want everyone to be in full communion with the Catholic Church. And at the same time, we want to say, if you're coming from somewhere else, your gifts can enrich us. That our house, in a sense, can be sort of, can take on new fixtures that by God's grace have been able to flourish despite the separation, or the distance between the fullness of communion and particular Christian groups over the centuries. And so, yeah, I love the ordinariates. My family and I are officially members of the personal ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter here in North America. Though we live so far away from the parish where we are technically members that we don't often go there. And in fact, I have, one of my jobs, my day job, as it were, is at a Catholic parish that's not an ordinariate parish. So, we're very much at home in kind of the mainstream, American, Catholic Church as well. But we're so grateful to kind of have these resources to share, and this important stuff from our background that now kind of has a new life in the Catholic Church.
Yes, absolutely. And is reaching people that wouldn't normally have exposure to that, which I think is beautiful. I mean, for example, I was not raised Anglican. I go to an ordinary at Mass, and it's incredible. You read the prayer book; it's incredible. These traditions are beautiful. So it is only enriching the church. Unlike the ecumenism of the Matt Redman songs from the '90s that we sometimes sing at our an unnamed, unmentioned Mass. Those aren't necessarily the same kind of gifts that my evangelical background has to bring to the Catholic Church. Is not quite the same as the beautiful patrimony of the Anglican tradition.
Yeah, isn't that funny? I notice that too sometimes when I'm at a particular Mass and they'll play, like now in the year of our Lord 2025, kind of like evangelical worship song that I remember from 1996. Yeah. And I'll think, oh my goodness.
My wife and
I don't get it.
We just feel warm and fuzzy inside when those songs come on, and kind of roll our eyes a little bit because there's much better music out there. Yeah. So okay, I want to dig right into some of the context, some of the contents of this fantastic book, because you are talking from the context of this is a convert. We'll dig into that word probably a bit later, to the Catholic faith. Somebody who's come into the Catholic faith, and again, so many listeners, viewers, those who are looking from the outside into the Catholic faith, or those who are sometimes raised in the Catholic faith, also cradle Catholics, have sometimes misconceptions about what the Catholic faith is and isn't. And some of those things really get in the way of a real understanding, get in the way of full communion, and put people off on the wrong track. I know many of our stories, right, mine included, and many listeners, viewers to the show, have those misconceptions that once you begin to unbox or unpack those, you realize what you thought the Catholic Church was completely backwards. And what it actually is super compelling, and you want to dive right in, or at least look further into this mystery, right? So I think this is fantastic. And one of the very first thing that struck me of your book out of the gate is this tackling the idea of denominations. Mm-hmm. So important. I remember my first encounter with this was actually from G.K. Chesterton, who wrote about the idea of the Catholic Church. And I don't even know where this came from. You may know the reference, because I can't remember where it came from anymore. But it was the idea that, look, you're looking at the Catholic Church and you're Christianity. You're seeing all these little different pockets of Christianity, these little market stalls in a fair or something. And you realize at one point, well, where's the Catholic Church in all these denominations? And you realize the Catholic Church is actually the tent that all of these denominations are within, because it isn't really a denomination. And I like how you start off this chapter essentially asking ChatGPT about the Catholic Church, which then launches you into this idea, because maybe you can tell us what the response was, and begin to unpack why that response is wrong, why the Catholic Church isn't properly thought of as a denomination. What did AI tell you, Andrew?
Yeah, let me go to my book here so I don't misquote ChatGPT. But yeah, so I had this idea, Keith. Right. Well, I had this idea. So, let me start by saying, the question of whether the Catholic Church is a denomination was kind of the central question I wanted to answer in this book called The Faith Unboxed, which my original working title of the book was called What the Catholic Church Is Not. Apparently, like, not doesn't work so well in marketing and that sort of thing. So the editors convinced me that it's probably better to kind of reframe it a little bit. And I'm really happy with the way that it came out, with this idea that there are all these different misperceptions that ultimately make the big vision of what the church is simply too small. So even if we're kind of well-meaning about some of the terms that we use, but then there are a lot of other terms that are not well-meaning that are, very negative. But in any case, there are these misperceptions on all different sides, and they all end in the wrong place. They don't end with a totalizing vision of reality, the experience of the experience of life on earth with God, in the hope of life in heaven with God, which is ultimately like what the church is about. Instead, we end up settling for smaller things. And probably the most common thing that we settle for is something like the Catholic Church is just a big denomination. Maybe it's even the best denomination, but we still kind of settle on this idea that it's kind of one among many. Now, so I decided to ask ChatGPT, I don't know why. I thought, let's try this. I really hate AI, and I'm not really a big techie guy, but so I thought maybe I was trying to embarrass ChatGPT by getting a dumb answer back. But I asked ChatGPT, what is the Roman Catholic Church? And ChatGPT wrote back, the Roman Catholic Church, often simply referred to as the Catholic Church, is the largest Christian denomination in the world. Okay, so that's what ChatGPT said. Now, what's wrong with that? So many things. Let's just start with this idea that, okay, if there certainly are people in the world who have a kind of denominational mindset. And so if that's their mindset, then they may have to settle for some kind of definition that includes the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is a denomination, and indeed the largest one, and maybe the most compelling one, maybe the one that makes the best truth claims. But when we step back and ask what the Catholic Church says about itself, the Catholic Church does not ever anywhere describe itself as a denomination. So we just need to acknowledge that right off the bat, that the Catholic Church does not use that word about itself. It never has. It's not in any church documents with reference to itself. And in fact, even where the Catholic Church talks about other groups, it tends to use the words like groups. It tends to say ecclesial groups. When we're talking about Eastern Orthodox churches, it uses the word churches, and it has a very technical understanding about what that means. But we're never talking about denominations. Now, what is this denominational thinking all about? Well, I make the point in the book that in modern English, we tend to use the word denomination in only two ways. Only two ways. One way is with regard to religion, that, hey, you're a Catholic, you're a Baptist, you're a Methodist, whatever that may be. And we may make different kind of judgments about the person who belongs to a different denomination. There's kind of one version of it, which is extremely critical, which is to say all the other denominations are wrong and mine is right. Or there's kind of we might call it the liberal version of that, the flip side of that, which says, hey, we're all just different denominations, but we all kind of believe the same thing. So let's not get too worked up about it, right? So there are these sort of two different sides, right? With regard to denominations, with regard to religion. Now, the other way that we use it is for money. And now we don't use a lot of cash anymore in the world, but when we did, if you had a check to cash and you went to the bank teller would ask you, what denomination would you like that in? And I used an example in the book from the movie Big, where Tom Hanks is, a 13-year-old in the body of a 30-year-old, and he gets his first paycheck and he takes it to the bank and he wants to get it cashed. And because he thinks like a kid, he thinks it'll be fun to get $100 bill and 87 ones and some number of dimes or something like that, right? And the teller kind of gives him a funny look at first, but then she's like, all right. And she starts counting out the $1 bills because it doesn't matter to her, right? Money is money. $187, it doesn't matter to her. It all cashes out the same in the end. And that tends to be the way that we think about Christianity. Now, why has it sort of worked that we have thought that way? Well, I make the point in the book that it's kind of it's a good thing, but also kind of the worst thing that ever happened to the Catholic Church in a place like the United States of America, that the Catholic Church ever came to be considered a denomination, because it didn't used to be. It used to be that the one constant in a place like the United States, and probably Canada too, maybe except for in Quebec, was that the one unifying principle about Protestantism, the one principle that united everybody was not Roman Catholic, right? There's all these different ways to be Christians, and we can hash that out amongst ourselves, but we know we're not like those guys. We know we're not Catholics, right? as late as the early 20th century, there were riots in northeastern cities in America about Catholics, about the waves of Catholic immigrants, Italians and Irish in particular, who didn't assimilate religiously. They built new churches, and they grew. They had big families, much bigger families than a lot of the Protestants, right? Although everybody still had pretty big families back then for somewhat obvious reasons. But anyway, but in World War I, things started to change. A lot of Catholics went to Europe and fought alongside their Protestant and Jewish neighbors. They came back. The same thing happened again in World War II, except on a much bigger scale. And Roman Catholics, by the way, in the United States anyway, maybe in Canada too, were overrepresented for their share of the population in terms of the number of men, and personnel who went to fight in Europe. So everybody comes back. They've all been in the trenches together. They've all gone through this generational defining experience. They all come home and they decide, we don't want to fight about our differences. We want to be a people. And so they eased into this idea that denominationalism was kind of the way forward. And oh, by the way, this coincided with what was going to happen in the next couple of decades, where really the modern ecumenical movement got born, and it more or less had the predominant ethos of denominations are the way things are. Yes, of course, we all hope one day, in that heavenly reality, we'll all be reunited. But hey, here and now, let's not worry too much about it. Let's find common ground where we can, and let's not make too big a deal about the differences that we have. So that was kind of my starting point on the denominational stuff. And there's probably more to say, but I'll pause there, I guess.
Yeah, it's a fantastic narrative, and you're right. It echoes very familiarly in Canada. We have enshrined, actually, in our Constitution, the existence of a publicly funded Catholic school system, as opposed to the public school system, which was but de facto Protestant, right? There was seen to be that need when our country was founded to protect this thing here for Catholics, and then everybody else who was just not Catholic was in this kind of school system here. So it's right in our Constitution as a country in Canada, which is fascinating. But it's an interesting trajectory, right? That kind of the dulling down of those differences maybe, and just kind of that idea that the Catholic faith is just another faith amongst all these kind of other faiths that are also Christian. You lose kind of those sharp edges. But the important thing, as you underscore, Andrew, is that the church itself never identifies itself in that way. There's no such thing as denominations to the Catholic Church, because it's the Catholic Church. And then I guess the next kind of question is, well, then what do we make of denominations? And I mean, you so eloquently put this in the book, that how we as Catholics see Protestants, right? That Protestants aren't something else, but somewhere else, I think is so fascinating. So how do we make sense of this idea then? How do we make sense of that idea that, okay, if we as Catholics aren't part of a denomination, how do we understand, interact? How do we make that clear when we're talking to or trying or making the faith compelling to others who see the faith as another choice amongst others, another denomination amongst a bunch of denominations, and none of us can get along. None of us can kind of come together at some point. So it doesn't really matter where you go. There's a lot in there, Andrew, but maybe begin by the idea of how ought we to understand Protestantism, these denominations, as Catholics.
Yeah. Well, okay. If we're talking to Protestants, a great place to go is the Bible, of course, right? Where we see in the New Testament, and you've had this conversation with many other people, but it's pertinent here that where we see the church actually alive. It's not something waiting to come into existence. It exists, right? It exists in Acts chapter 2. It is not a theory. It is not something. It is not invisible. It's visible and it's substantial. At the end of Acts chapter 2, those upon whom the Holy Spirit has been poured they continue to break bread and pray. They say their prayers. We see St. Paul kind of interacting with different groups. I think 1 Corinthians is a great place to go, chapters 10 and 11, and really the whole book. But that's such a great place to go, where this very question of what does it mean to belong to the church? Is it possible to sort of go your own way, have different colors, different variations, where these very questions are being dealt with? So I like to start there, because what that does then is it sets the table to say the church is not and cannot be divided. It is one. The church is one, right? And so then, the question becomes, okay, so the church isn't divided and it can't be divided. So then why are all these different groups out there that disagree with each other and even make rival truth claims about each other? The Catholic Church, I think, has great language for how to handle this. The Catholic Church is able to say, look, we believe we are that same church that was born in the upper room in Acts chapter 2. We're the same ones. John Henry Newman's so helpful in helping us understand how that church is the same church that you and I go to every weekend, right? Okay, so we're the same as that. But then there are all these other groups that don't come to our buildings. They go to their own buildings and they have their own catechisms, or maybe not, or maybe they have their own worship styles, or whatever these kinds of things may be. The Catholic Church says to those people, you're not nothing. You're not nothing. If you're baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you're one of us, actually. You are one of us. You have a real connection to the one church, right? Now, there are degrees of separation. I mean, just like there may be with a family. So the Catholic Church uses the language of separated brethren. There are groups that are apart from each other. And there are groups that are closer or farther from that fullness, the vision of fullness that we believe is what it means to belong to the Catholic Church. So I don't know, for me, Keith, when I came to realize that, I really felt wanted. I felt desired, because I finally understood that the Catholic Church wasn't saying, I mean, yes, on some level, ultimately, it's an all or nothing proposition. It's, as Luigi Giussani says, the most important question ever asked is Jesus Christ, yes or no? And I do believe that, like, ultimately, that's what it's about. That's what this decision to belong to the fullness of the faith in the Catholic Church is ultimately about. It isn't this question of, like, am I joining the right group? But, like, do I belong to Christ? Do I believe the truth claims, right? But that said, there are, I'm losing my thread a little bit, but there are, for all kinds of historical reasons, for example, that John Paul II talks about in his great ecumenical document, Ut Unum Sint, there are just, like, all these reasons why, like, a human being is walking around in the world not in full communion with the Catholic Church, right? And so the Catholic Church is able to say, come in, bring the gifts, join, and for those of us who are already in, there's this sort of housekeeping project, or house cleaning project even, that is sort of alluded to in the Catholic Church's documents as well, that we need to make room. It doesn't mean changing our doctrine, the exact opposite, but we're sort of understanding that we're not, and I get into this in the book, but, like, we're not a club. We're not sort of, like, trying to keep people out because of ethnicities or because of, like, certain customs or anything like that. Everybody belongs. Here comes everybody, right? That's the idea.
Yes. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And it is such a, I mean, I think about, like you said, people are walking around not even realizing that they're not in, that this denominationalism that they're just born into isn't biblical, isn't the fruit of what Christ intended for his church on earth. I can think of, and I've mentioned before on the show, when I decided to accept Jesus at, like, age 14, like, after a bonfire at a friend's house, I had this kind of come to Jesus moment, quite literally. I went and I asked my best friend, who was a Christian, what I do next, and he took me to the Christian bookstore, and I asked the woman behind the counter for a Bible, and I got the Extreme Teen Study Bible, and I was off to the races, because that's the tradition that I was kind of born into or born again into was this was how you were Christian. You had a Bible, you read it, you found a local church to join, and that's how you were Christian. That's what I inherited, because those around me inherited that, and they had inherited it from somebody else. You talked about, your ancestors being some of the first kind of Protestants. My wife did her genealogy recently, and quite literally, I think she's the first Catholic ever on her mom's side who are Dutch, Dutch or German kind of Mennonites who came over, from that tradition. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. And of course, they were Catholic before then, but I mean, as far back as you can go, as history shows, right? So we inherit these traditions, I think, most of the time without realizing that that perspective that we have, we're born into, that these are all denominations and that's just how it is, isn't like you say, biblical, isn't the way it's meant to be. And I think if we take a second to step back and maybe let our prejudices fall back a little bit, if we're looking at the Catholic Church from the outside, the Catholic Church has the beat on this, has the one kind of answer that makes sense, that there aren't denominations. There's got to be an original, and I guess I'm kind of rambling here, Andrew, I'm sorry, but it comes back to, you mentioned ecclesiology in the very, very beginning of the book. Yeah. And this is what it comes down to, right? If you really have to look and say, okay, well, when did these denominations begin? Why were those good reasons? What happened before then, right? And I think with the Bible in one hand and a good sense of history in the other, you begin to see that the reasons why denominationalism was kind of born and the state of things, the Catholic Church has a pretty good answer about how it actually should be, right? When it says, when it locates that truth in the Catechism, in the Church's teaching, right? It makes a lot of sense. More sense than I'm making now, Andrew.
No, it makes perfect sense. And, I tell people to read church documents. They're actually not, and, I know you've had lots of guests who do the same, but I mean, they're not nearly as daunting, a lot of them, as people might imagine. And there's just, a lot of questions that perplex people, that perplexed me, are ones that have been thought about a whole lot, actually, by the Catholic Church for a long, long time. So yeah, I mean, that's really, I think ultimately that's the place to start, is getting your head around what are the truth claims that are being proposed by the Catholic Church, and then not the caricature of them, not like what you were told by your Protestant pastor or what you're being told by the culture, the kind of post-Christian culture, but to actually look at what the Catholic Church says about itself and has said about itself, and then begin contemplating, is this where I belong? And I think more times than not, the answer to that question ends up being, I can't see myself anywhere else. I couldn't possibly see myself anywhere else.
Yeah. You make the great the great point of talking about the idea of swimming the Tyber as being that metaphor for becoming Catholic. You swim the Tyber, and how I know we use sloppy words like convert, and I don't, there's a lot of problems with words like that and polemics, but swimming the Tyber fits perfect, because it's that kind of crossing, right? You're bringing with you the gifts, the patrimony that you have, your upbringing. I don't think I've talked to a single convert in over 6 years of doing this show that said they've lost something in becoming Catholic.
Right.
It's you're not, like you said before in the beginning of the show, you're not running away from something. You're running into the arms of something, right? So maybe you're leaving that small denomination that met in that community hall, right, in that upper room with that skating rink, and off there. What you're joining is entering into this stream of this tradition that goes back to Christ and has all of these things for you. That includes what you have and what you're bringing, right? Because that is already, as a baptized Christian, you're already part of the Catholic Church. You're just now coming closer into what it was all along, right? You say it better in the book and in person than I am, but it's not a change. It's a coming closer to that thing that what was always meant to be there, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think the image of crossing the Tiber, it's kind of a much used expression when people talk about becoming Catholic, but I think it's a good one for a number of reasons. One, I like its sort of resonance with biblical imagery of like crossing over Jordan.
Yeah.
So the idea that like you're on a journey, that you already belong to God's people, right? But he is leading you on a journey to the promised land, in a sense. And what do we know about reading the Old Testament is once the people of God got to the promised land, it was the land flowing with milk and honey, but it was also a place of intense warfare, and it's a place that's going to be very difficult to live in sometimes. So just because you sort of arrive at just because you've sort of arrived in the Catholic Church doesn't mean it's going to be easy. In fact, in some respects, it's an invitation to a more difficult life from a practical perspective. And maybe we can get into that.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, so I've always liked that, and I touch on this a lot in the book. The idea that we want to think in terms of journey. Now that can also be kind of that can kind of almost become platitudinous and sound almost mealy-mouthed from people like, oh, look, we're all just on a journey, but like, no, we are in a real sense on a real journey. But the thing is, there is a destination, and it's a real place. Yes. John Henry Newman talks about this in his Apologia Pro Vita Sua. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't quote it exactly, but right after he finishes the chapter where he's made his 2-day-long confession and he's received, and he becomes finally, he comes into the fullness of communion with the Catholic Church. The next chapter begins with, it was like, I had come into port after years at rough sea. But I mean, he's the guy who ended up then living a couple of decades of his life after that, kind of shut out of the world in a lot of ways that he had enjoyed for a long, long time. So, I mean, he wasn't saying like, everything's perfect now, but he was saying like, I understood myself to have reached a destination.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to point out for listeners and viewers that you don't have the Apologia Pro Vita Sua in front of you. That's a shameful, Mr. Petiprin. That's shameful. You don't have that immediately.
As I told you before we started, Keith, I'm broadcasting from the bunker tonight. Yeah, I'm not in my my resource rich office at the moment.
Excuses. Newman should always be at your elbow, sir. You know better than this. You mentioned the idea of that incredible shift, and it's such a strange shift, but it makes so much sense. That idea of going from, say, a preference to going to a church that tells you what you have to do, right, in the Catholic Church, and that shift, and that's such a fascinating, complicated, difficult, interesting shift. I can think of so many converts that I've had on the show that have tried, and myself included, that have described the idea of, okay, so I'm a Protestant. I am choosing a church to go to based on how my reading of Scripture lines up with that church's values, and maybe the music and maybe the programming and other things are also involved in that decision ultimately, which sometimes is the case for the Catholic Church. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm picking a church that I think is a biblical church, that is a church that I'm going to go to, right? You become Catholic, you cross the Tyber, and suddenly you're in a church that is going to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
And I've often said that, and this is harsh, but I think it's true. The Catholic Church doesn't actually care what you think, which I think is it sounds spicy, but it's also incredibly freeing and 100% true, right? Can we unpack that a little bit? The idea of that shift to now you are submitting, you're being told what to do, and that doesn't. It's very countercultural.
It is very countercultural, but it actually, I think, for people who, especially people who come into the Catholic Church from a secular background, I hear this a lot, that they come to believe that these rules, these restrictions, are incredibly liberating.
Yes,
because you're actually then able to kind of understand. You're able, first of all, to receive all the gifts of kind of living into the fullness of your humanity. And ultimately, look, that's what being alive in this world in communion with God is about. It like, I make the point in the book, there's this movie called St. Vincent that has Bill Murray in it and Chris O'Dowd, the Irish actor. And he plays this. It's kind of a funny, as you often find, Keith, when Catholic clerics or Catholic situations are depicted in movies, they're sometimes a little weird and they don't make a lot of sense. So there's this teacher character whose name is Brother something or other, not Father, but he dresses like a priest. And anyway, it's sort of funny. But so this new student enters the classroom and he says, "We welcome all faiths here, but Catholicism is the best because we have the most rules." Now, like on the one hand, what he's saying is like, there's a way in which you can look at what he's saying and you can see that that's correct from a certain point of view. Like, again, that person who comes into the Catholic Church and finds the freedom in the structure, the person who's sort of free to be alive finally and not just sort of accept whatever the world prescribes. On the other hand, we have to remember that, I think too often we forget that the dogma of the church, like if you open up the Catechism of the Catholic Church, what you're finding in there is a description of reality, not a prescription of some kind of arbitrary, kind of like arbitrary way of living, right? We believe that the way we ought to live has been revealed to us.
Yes.
And, of course, the church requires, in a sense, many things of us, because, I mean, just like a parent with children, we require things of our children because we know what is good for them. So if we believe that being free of mortal sin, that such a category exists, which we do, and I think that's one of those things which, when you begin to go down the trail a little bit with people and talk to them about different types of choices that they make and the severity of certain things that you can do, it really does kind of make sense to people. So then when you believe, well, there's this mechanism that's given to the world by Jesus to take that away, and once it's taken away, there's yet another mechanism that has been given to the world to be kind of nourished with grace day in and day out. Well, then of course the church will require that of people because it's the way to be fully human.
Yes.
So I go into this in the book, but there's a whole lot of other categories too, Keith, and maybe this is on your list of things to think about. But there are a lot of like kind of hard realities about living life as a Catholic that sometimes the world doesn't understand, and it may take a little longer for individuals who are curious about a lot of what the Catholic Church is about to wrap their heads around. One of them has to do with marriage. People often say, well, the Catholic Church is the church that's against divorce, or the denomination, even worse, that's against divorce. Well, why would I want to pick that one since most marriages end in divorce or whatever? Well, no, I mean, the Catholic Church isn't the denomination that's against divorce, but it certainly is the one that's for marriage. And so, if we believe that marriage is a sacrament and indissoluble, then the church needs to be involved in a situation where a marriage isn't going to keep going, and so that gets difficult. But then, the world throws its hands up and say, well, you just can't expect people to, abide by these things. Life is just too difficult and too complicated, or maybe with regard to like same-sex attraction or various other kind of hot button issues that are going on today. And no one can possibly sort of accept this heavy yoke. But then you start looking around, Keith, and you start talking to people and you realize there are actually a lot of people who do have these situations in their lives, real situations where a marriage has broken down, or whether they are same-sex attracted, or whether, a whole lot of things like that. And yet they seek grace day in and day out to live a life that is ultimately much more fulfilling to them than what they're being told by the culture is sort of what would be a freer way to go about life in the world. So I forget how I got all the way down this rabbit hole, but the freedom thing and the rules, right?
Yes, it's fantastic. I could think of when I was discerning Catholicism and looking into spending exorbitant months of time on YouTube in its infancy, watching debates and things like that, and lectures. And I encountered this old, it must have been converted from like a VHS tape. The quality was all grainy, and mind you, YouTube in its infancy was also always kind of grainy and very low quality in the early days. But here I was watching this debate between, I think it was James White, a famous Protestant apologist who I'm sure listeners, viewers would know who that is, and Father Mitch on this idea of scripture and tradition. I remember the end of the debate, the closing arguments, James White brings out this whole 2 rolling suitcases worth of textbooks and plunks them on the table, and he's unpacking them one by one. It's very, very theatrical. And he says, look, this is all the things you must believe to be a Catholic. and then holds his Bible up. It's like this is what you have to believe to be a Protestant Christian. So we're right. And that was kind of his big theatrical, and it looked pretty impressive, right? There's stacks of books behind him, and oh my goodness, all these rules the Catholic Church have added on to the simple message of the gospel. It seemed like a pretty good argument. Father Mitch kind of walks out, and his typical kind of down-home style, and says, well, yeah, but things have happened since the Bible was written 2,000 years ago. There have been new things to talk about that the church this talks about. Like, what's wrong with that? And I remember watching that debate, and I was still rooting for the Protestant side at that point in my journey, and I went, well, yeah, of course that makes sense. Like, of course, there has to be a body that has the ability to talk about things that have happened since the time of Christ, right? It made perfect sense. And I think that's what you're saying, the same thing here, right? Those dogmas, those doctrines I have come to understand are not there to put things in the way of my faith or the way of my happiness or the way of my joy or to ruin my life. Those are there because Christ gave the church the authority to teach, and the church has discerned that, hey, these are good things we should know about how to live because God made us and knows how we work. And the church, he's given the authority to help us understand how to live our lives most in sync with our Creator, right? That makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, that's right. This just reminds me, there's this great little book, and I don't know where it is. I used to own it, but I think I might have loaned it to somebody. But there's this great little book that was co-written by Joseph Ratzinger and Christoph Schönborn, who were the kind of architects of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the 92, 93, John Paul II Catechism. And in that little book, I forget which of the two men. I think they both make the point in various ways, but they basically make the point that we want to get away from talking. We want to get away from leading with sentences that start with "the Church teaches." Now, it doesn't mean that we don't want to say the Church teaches. We do want to say that, but we don't want to just come across to the world well, we have these things that we teach, and and so this is the way we are. No, the church teaches these things because they're true, right? Yeah, so this is why, like today's catechism, which I'm a big fan of, it is not designed to be a manual in the same way that maybe earlier catechisms might have been, and those are fine, those are great, and just as authoritative, and there's nothing wrong with those, right? But maybe the way, and maybe it's just where we are in the world now, in this kind of post-Christian world, at least in the West, is like the way that we are proposing the faith anew to separated brethren, to non-Catholic Christians, and to the world at large, is to say, look, we have a way of understanding how to live. And as you said, Keith, I mean, how to live is complicated, I mean, there's just all kinds of different things that come up, and that that things come and go, and so the church has a lot of rich resources to look at.
Yeah, and you tell a great story in the book about a friend of yours who has lived for the last 20 years not receiving communion because the church's teaching about marriage says X. They are not able to align with that teaching for various reasons. Despite how difficult that seems, right, to be a Catholic and be at odds with this thing that is wrong about what's going on here, yet persevere in that faith. Like, that looks from the outside, for all intents and purposes, like this person's being punished by the church and ought to leave the church or become very miserly. But that person, we have to believe, is living the best possible life despite those appearances, right? Because the church knows what's best for us. It isn't putting those barriers in to punish us, but to give us the opportunity to draw as close to Christ as possible, right? I think that was very profound. And I know others who are in similar circumstances, right? Whether it's same-sex attraction, whether it's somebody, a marriage that can't be dissolved, that for whatever reason, that a person is just choosing to live that single life, but not receiving the Eucharist because they're not in. I mean, those are beautiful, powerful, difficult stories, but that highlights the intention of the church, not to punish, but to draw as close as possible, right?
Yeah. I mean, I face this question, do I want to belong to full communion with a living authority on the planet Earth, namely the Pope, or do I want to be my own Pope? Because it really does come down to that. It comes down to that dichotomy. And so this friend of mine, that I talk about in the book, a real guy, and you know, his story is actually not that uncommon. There are a lot of people like this, but I mean, this is a daily mass goer. I mean, this is a guy who believes and he's involved. And you know what happened in his life was he was married. His marriage ended. He drifted away from the church. He, in kind of a civil perspective, got remarried to a woman he loved very much. And it's taking a really, really long time to figure out whether that first marriage is going to be able to be annulled or whatever. I mean, it's hard. But yeah, this guy, day in and day out, month after month, year after year, just keeps at it. And he told me, you know, I don't like this, but I'm really glad that it's not up to me. You know, because if it were, then I just don't think that the rest of this stuff would be real. You know, all this stuff is real because it's not me. It's not me making it up. It's not me choosing the way I wish it was.
Yeah. That's so well put. And you talk about you said before, Andrew, the church is not prescribing, it's describing. Like, in these so-called rules of the church, right? In this so-called the catechism and the piling on of the doctrines and dogmas and what have you that can sometimes seem off-putting for those from the outside. These aren't things the church is telling us we must do. It's describing what already exists, the world that God has created and how we best fit in there, which I think is a really profound difference, right? That's a big difference between looking for, say, a denomination that fits my preconceived notions of what a scriptural, biblical, Bible-based church looks like versus choosing to submit to, again, ecclesiology, that church that traces itself back to the very origins of the apostles, right? And their mission, right? And the idea of that their successors are passing on this thing. Those are two very different things, I think, to encounter, right? But the church is just describing what as it sees reality is, right? That's I love that.
Yeah, I don't know if this was the case. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No. Yeah, no.
Well, I'll just say really quickly, I don't know if this was the case with you, but you know, when my family and I came into full communion with the Catholic Church, there were a lot of people who congratulated us and were happy for us because their support was kind of grounded in like, well, we're happy that you've kind of found the thing that works for you, you know. And my reaction then, and much more so now, you know, 6+ years in or whatever, is like, well, it doesn't work that well some of the time, to be honest with you. I mean, it's hard, but I mean, you know, and again, Newman said something like, you know, 1,000 difficulties do not make one regret. That's, I mean, yeah. Would you want it to be easy? I wouldn't. Yes. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm built differently than some people, but you know the difference between real and made up, and real is hard. It just is on this side of eternity, right? Yes, absolutely. I want to mention one more thing before we wrap up, and this idea that the church, that we need to get away from the idea of the church as merely an institution, right? Mm-hmm. This thing that kind of exists out there that we can choose, like you're saying, to either be a part of or not, but it's just an institution. It's not that's merely what it is. I can think of, for me, a real shift happened when we were, the last church we were part of before my wife and I became Catholic was this non-denominational, you joked, and I think it's very accurate, journey kind of based church. That was the mantra, was we're a journey based church. So our statement of doctrine was very, very sparse because we were on a journey. That church, unfortunately, imploded after we left because the journey was becoming too fragmented. But many people were hurt in that breakup. So it wasn't, I joke now, it wasn't very funny, but the writing was on the wall, this kind of loosely framed journey mentality. But I digress. This was the church we were meeting as a part of for a long time. All our friends were there. And we had met in a rec center for a long time, for most of the existence of the church.
in this community center, we set up the chairs every week, set up a little stage and set things up. And it was very much kind of a homegrown kind of movement. And the shift happened for us when we decided to, as a congregation, lease or rent some space inside of a Lutheran church in the same city where we were already meeting, kind of a few blocks away. And so suddenly we were this non-denominational church. We met in a rec hall, meeting in this building that looked like a church, that had pews. It was quite a high, Lutheran congregation. So there was an altar, there was actually a tabernacle, and there was a sanctus candle. There was all the trappings of quite a high religion from our perspective. And I can remember thinking, for the first time, this idea of these sacred spaces, these sacred, institutions, the church as something other than just us kind of meeting in this upper room. But there were churches, there were purpose-built churches. There were denominations that existed and outlasted these buildings. And I really began to, for the first time, think of, well, what is the church in a sense of a history kind of beyond, our existence in and out of this thing, right? So this thing was here before I was here. It'll be here kind of afterwards. And actually, there's lots of churches around town like this. It was eye-opening for me in the sense that it was the first time that I kind of began to encounter this institutional church, right? Mm-hmm. So I wonder if we can unpack that. I'm doing a horrible job trying to describe my experience, Andrew, but I wonder if you can salvage that in some way. This is idea of that the church as a mere institution, as a mere thing that puts churches up in places, and guys that meet about things who are bishops and have councils and make decisions, versus how we actually ought to understand the church and the Catholic Church in that kind of
yeah
thing.
Yeah. It's funny. Yeah. So I have a whole chapter here that I think that thinking of the Catholic Church as just an institution is not enough. But I do want to preface that before I really explain why I think that's the case by saying institutions are good. Yeah. Institutions are necessary. Yeah. Institutions are what form us, right? Schools, the military, sports teams, things that have, kind of trappings that are more than just built to last for one generation, or more than just meant to be there for kind of one individual or one family, or something like that, right? So institutions are very good, and the Catholic Church is the Catholic Church is institutional, very much so, in the sense that the Catholic Church is full of institutions. The Catholic Church has schools, hospitals. The Catholic Church has patterns of worship, patterns of formation, all these kinds of things which are deeply institutional. We have a priesthood which is institutional. So all that is real. We also have sacraments that were instituted by Christ. Yeah. So that's an important thing to remember. But that leads me to this bigger point, which is on a higher level, on a kind of on a truly, I guess, theological level. It's better to say that the Catholic Church is not an institution with sacraments, but a sacrament with institutions. So, in other words, like we have, we're even the best institutions have some kind of end to them, and they serve specific purposes. I mean, some institutions serve a whole lot of purposes, but still not every purpose under the sun. The Catholic Church serves every purpose, and it has an eternal significance, right? So it really is just much bigger than any worldly institution that we can think of. Now, the Catholic Church too often does behave as if it is merely an institution. And look, I respect so many senior churchmen. I really do. So there's so many great bishops, so many great priests. And also, there is a strong temptation when you ascend to high office in the church simply to do the maintenance of the institutions, because there's so much of it, right? I mean, you could just pull the levers on the old machine all day, every day, and you could get pats on the back, and you could get a nice retirement party, and that would be fine. But the truth is, what you're really called to do is so much bigger than that. what this also has played out as, and I think it's important to touch on this briefly, and I touch on it in the book, is that where the church fails institutionally, then it jeopardizes itself in this bigger mission, in this bigger identity that it has. And I think this absolutely happened with the clerical sex abuse scandals, because there were so many institutional failures with how all of that has been handled, that it actually has served not only to kind of weaken the church as an institution, but because the church is such, people kind of instinctively know that the institutions of the church serve a much bigger purpose than many other things in this world. It actually has served, in my opinion, to cause skepticism in our society at large against other formative institutions. So I think if the church kind of gets back to saying, look, we're full of institutions, we serve this function in the same way that like lots of other kinds of things in the world do, but ultimately we're something so much more. And if we keep our mind on that, even where we fail institutionally, we understand that our message is very compelling. And if our leaders are out there kind of representing that vision rather than just the kind of using the jargon of the church, raising money for this or that building or like whatever, with that, all that's fine, but we need to kind of also talk a lot bigger than that.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I love your point about the idea of the sacraments, right? It's, that was foundational, right? Encountering, because you can't really have, and we didn't certainly have sacraments like that in that same sense as a non-denominational church, because we were non-denominational. We had no roots, we had no grounding. You have to have that kind of grounding. You have to be instituted by something, right? Grounded in something, right? And so that hierarchy, that institutionalness, I think for me, what I was trying to describe was encountering that idea. The Lutheran pastor who wore a clerical collar, the altar, the tabernacle, those things that were part of this kind of hierarchy of things you have in this church that has a history. Encountering that is pretty profound and important. And I, of course, Andrew, I think it's important you point out where those things can go wrong too, right? Because they can. But there is, properly understood, properly demonstrated, properly participated in that institution, that thing instituted by Christ, right? That carries on the apostolic succession, right? That's a beautiful thing. That's the reason why we can have, we had Pope Francis during the COVID pandemic standing in St. Peter's in the pouring rain, praying for the entire world, because there was an institution that was established to do that, right? And all those trappings, for me, made sense in that moment there, right?
Yeah, so and instituted by Christ, right?
Yeah,
Christ didn't institute the United States Army, or Christ didn't institute, Harvard University or whatever it may be, right? And those are good, those are important institutions. But the church is really something of a far greater magnitude, so much so that we really need to kind of look at it as something more than an institution, although in a sense, like also serving as kind of the institution par excellence in the world.
Yes. And the last thing I just want to point out, because I think this was really profound for me, this idea that the institution par excellence, the culture, right? The culture par excellence, right? You talk at the beginning of the book about it being countercultural, but not countercultural in the sense that it's opposed to culture. It's that other culture. It's that truer culture, right? So it doesn't stand as the anti-everything naysayer. It stands, and we've talked about this, I think, at length. This made the cherry on top here, Andrew, but it stands as that beautiful, truth, life-giving thing that's countercultural in the sense that it's the other culture, right? You can be a part of. Mm-hmm. Forget all this, but this is right here. Even for those Protestant listeners and viewers, there is a huge shift that takes place when you're submitting to this other culture over here. And I think you'd agree, it's beautiful.
Yeah. And, the church is for the world. The message of the gospel is not, it's certainly a call to radical living. It is certainly a call to countercultural living, but it's also a call to transformation, self-transformation, but then also transformation of the world in which we live. I don't think that's, I talk in the book about how sometimes I'm a little skeptical of churches that have mission statements that talk about sort of like building the kingdom and stuff like that. Now, Pope John Paul II actually talked about building the kingdom a little bit, so I don't want to kind of dismiss that idea completely. But the wonderful thing that we can focus on when we're thinking about our relationship with the culture is that we're citizens of the kingdom of heaven, which has come near. And so, when we go to Mass, we can think about how we are. The Eastern Orthodox actually talk about this. Some of their representatives talk about this really beautifully, and some Roman Catholic thinkers do too. That that our experience of communion with each other and with Christ is, it is transformative of the world beyond us. And that's something that I think we need to keep in mind. Just the fact that we're doing it, that we belong to it, and that we're going about it is something that has an effect beyond just kind of getting our hearts right, our own individual relationships with Jesus kind of up and down, sorted out, right?
Yeah. That's fantastic. There was a book probably now decades ago, because we're getting old, Andrew, but by evangelical author Brian McLaren, that was called A New Kind of Christian. And I remember reading that book, and that was transformational for so many of us in that era when that book came out, because he was espousing this new way of, in air quotes, of being Christian. Of course, it was all the same old stuff, but I remember reading that book. One of his strong kind of points was that Christ came to redeem the whole world. And we should kind of be part of that. And this new kind of Christian is that kind of Christian that transforms the whole world by that kind of redemptive kind of spirit. Well, what you described right here, right? It's, of course, like that's fundamental to the Catholic Church, right? And Brian McLaren was a guy in a sea of denominations who was pretty non-denominational, right? He was one of the guys that spawned like the emergent church non-denominational movement that, of course, can't do that kind of thing in a bunch of disparate different denominations, right? Here's the Catholic Church, this institution, this organization, this body of Christ that can be the hands and feet, right? To do that redemptive work, right? In the Mass every single Sunday, right? Through the sacraments, right? Through all these means that Christ gave us, they can do the kind of things that we longed to do as evangelicals, like in the 90s, right? It's here. This is that thing.
Yeah, I remember as an evangelical, like really, really kind of being made to feel like something like Christendom is really a bad thing. Why? Because it basically just gives birth to generation after generation after generation of dead faith. So if you just live in a culture where, everybody's Catholic, you just take your babies for baptism, go to Mass, whatever, it's like you're a culture that is a pretend, like you're all pretend Christians. I have come to see that completely the opposite. I mean, we happen to be living in a post-Christendom world, and that's the way it is. And we just have to cope with that. We have to find new ways to propose the faith or whatever. But it would be better if we were a Christian culture. It would be better if it just everybody was Catholic. And my cat is meowing now and kind of wanting to contribute to the conversation. But yeah, and so and that just underlines your point that that our faith is for the world. The great Anglican thinker N.T. Wright, he had a big impact on me, and I still like him. I still like his work. But he made this point in several places that stuck with me when I first heard it, where he talks about where Jesus is talking to Pontius Pilate, and the typical translation of that was always, my kingdom is not of this world. And he always said, you really need to look closely at that and translate that my kingdom is not from this world. Why? Because it is definitely for this world. So if we're saying like, my kingdom's not of this world, like, we don't really have to do with that sort of thing. No, that is not at all what Jesus is saying. And that's really never the way the Catholic Church has behaved. It's just not. In the early days, maybe, Catholics were, sort of had to live underground for fear of persecution. Maybe things like that are coming back again. I don't know. I hope not. But yeah, as soon as the Catholic Church could establish itself as like, hey, this is the way we organize ourselves, people, it did it. And we should ultimately be striving for that, even if it's centuries away. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew, always a pleasure talking to you. Hopefully not a 5-year gap in our next conversation, but I'm always happy to have you on the show. It's a real pleasure. I'll put links to certainly this book in the show notes. Anything else, anywhere else you want to point listeners towards? You have a lot of good stuff on the go. where do you want to point them towards?
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff. Yeah, I definitely love for people to check out the book, buy the book. You can buy it directly from Catholic Answers Press if you go to shop.catholic.com, or you can buy it on Amazon, or you can buy it, anywhere you buy your books. So I'd love for you guys to pick that up. I run this little initiative with my old colleague from Word on Fire, Robert Mixa. It's called the Spe Salvi Institute, SPESALVI, Spe Salvi, after the encyclical of Pope Benedict XVI. So you can check us out at spacesalviinstitute.com. We have a podcast and we have some articles up on our website. We're eventually moving towards like study tours and kind of seminar type things. We're very interested in Europe, to pick up my point that I was making before about kind of, where are we now as kind of a Christian society? So we actually sort of think that it's still worth looking to the old world and kind of the treasures of what was once a great Christian society to help us revitalize the church in our own cultures, whether we're in North America or in the global South or wherever that may be. So yeah, check us out, spacesalviinstitute.com. That's a good place to go.
Awesome stuff. Fantastic stuff. I'll put those links in the show notes, Andrew. Listen, I want to thank you for being here. I want to say God bless you, the work you're doing for the church, and thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you back on the show, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Keith. It's been a lot of fun.